Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today's video begins with a recent phone call from subscriber Kenneth Karstetter, who is 86 years young and an avid watcher of these videos. During the call, Ken talked about his grandfather, Rudolph Karstetter, who served in the ranks of Company E of the 7th Pennsylvania Cavalry. Ken never knew his grandfather, who died before his birth, but we both noted how nowadays descendants of Civil War veterans usually have several greats in front of the word grandfather. In this case, with Ken, his Civil War connection, his grandfather, is just a generation away. Ken pointed me to this image, the one pictured here. This is a detail of a group of veterans from the 7th Pennsylvania Cavalry at the Chickamauga commemorations in around 1897. You can see, if you look in the lower right-hand corner, there is a man fourth from the right who is in the first row kneeling. He has a longish gray beard. He has a light-colored hat. He has one hand draped over his knee and the other hand holding a cane. Well, that gentleman is his grandfather, Rudolph Karstetter. This image, by the way, comes from a book titled Pennsylvania at Chickamauga and Chattanooga, Ceremonies at the Dedication of Monuments Erected by the State of Pennsylvania. And that was an extremely important battle. Chickamauga, certainly, and Chattanooga as part of that larger campaign. Important battles, not only to the Union Army, the Confederate Army, and the Civil War, but to the 7th Pennsylvania. But it was another battle, and that's Stones River, where Private Karstetter was reportedly captured, according to Ken, by Confederate raiders who burned the wagon train. So here's a closer up view of Rudolph Karstetter of the 7th Pennsylvania. According to Ken, as I mentioned, he was captured by Confederate raiders who burned the wagon train during the Battle of Stones River. And during the course of the conversation, we talked about, let's try to find out more information. So my first stop was to find out more about Karstetter himself, about his life dates, and just verifying his identity. So my first stop, which is fairly normal for me, is to go to Ancestry.com. And when I was there, I was quite delighted to find a photograph of him. And here he is pictured here. That gray beard is now a dark color. And as best I can tell, if you consider the clothing and the studio setting, there's a small table, and in the larger view, you can see a chair behind him. This probably dates to pretty shortly after the war, probably no later than the early 70s, the 1870s. So it's very likely that we're seeing him here pretty much as he appeared sans uniform during the Civil War years. Now, I also looked into his military service record and found a summary available through Historical Data Systems. It's also known to researchers as HDS. And that summary of his service tells us that he mustered into the regiment, the 7th Pennsylvania, in October of 1861, making him one of the early volunteers who responded to President Abraham Lincoln's call to defend the country and put down the rebellion. Karstetter remained in the ranks until August of 1865, almost 4 years altogether as a soldier, mustering out with his comrades in Georgia. Now, he and his regiment, the 7th Pennsylvania Cavalry, spent their enlistment in the Western Theater, fighting a long list of battles and campaigns well familiar to you students of the Civil War, including Perryville, Stones River, the Tullahoma Campaign, Hoover's Gap, Chickamauga, the Atlanta Campaign, Resaca, the Siege of Atlanta. The list of smaller engagements goes on, and other skirmishes and other minor actions. At Stones River, which I want to focus on because of Karstetter's involvement, was fought from December 31st to January 2nd, 1863. The battle holds the grim distinction of being one of the largest battles of the war with the highest percentage of casualties on both sides. Almost 14,000 men in the Union Army, commanded by Major General William S. Rosecrans, and 12,000 men in the Confederate Army, led by General Braxton Bragg, became casualties here. The 7th Cavalry did not play a major role in the battle, I found out, according to looking at the regimental history, which is titled 7th Pennsylvania Veteran Volunteer Cavalry, its record, reminiscences, and roster. It's by William B. Sipes, who was the regiment's colonel. Sipes, on a tragic note, did not live to see the book published, dying of pneumonia in 1905. In his narrative, Sipes describes the 7th's participation at Stones River. I'm going to read the most relevant passage to you just to give you a flavor of what the Pennsylvanians experienced during that battle. So here we go. On December 30th, the first day, the armies being in position, one battalion of the 7th and one of the 3rd Kentucky were detailed to form a line of couriers in the rear of the Union line for the purpose of conveying messages between the wings of the army and to stop skulkers to the rear. The bloody conflict, in which 100,000 men were joined, raged fearfully on the last 2 days of the year, and the 7th, with other regiments of the brigade, were engaged in protecting trains and guarding the wings of the Union Army. The 7th was charged in the afternoon of the 30th to retake a hospital which the enemy had captured, and they took it. During the day, Wheeler's, that's Joe Wheeler, his cavalry attacked the Union wagon trains at Laverne, and they captured a number of train guards, picked up several hundred stragglers, burnt a large number of wagons, and ran away with the mules. Put a pin in the wagon trains for a moment. I'll come back to it. In repulsing this onslaught and protecting Rosecrans' right, which the cavalry did effectually, it had to encounter vastly superior numbers, both mounted and dismounted, of the enemy. The 7th, as part of the 1st Brigade, was literally worked to the verge of absolute exhaustion. Speaking of the night of the 30th, both armies watched each other with a wakeful eye that night. The 7th served on vidette duty on the right. We sat on our horses, weary and hungry, with heavy eyelids and distended pupils. We strained the optic nerve to penetrate the thickening fog, to catch the outline of the victor of yesterday and the antagonist of tomorrow. We shall never forget how hard it was to keep awake. The eyelids would drop in spite of all we could do. By beating the skull with the fist and pinching the ears, we managed to keep sufficiently wakeful to halt the grand rounds. So that's that passage. The next day, I told you that I was putting a pin in the capture of the wagon trains. It goes on, the after action report of the regiment notes that the next day, on January 1st, the regiment's 7th Pennsylvania Cavalry's train was captured and burned by the Confederates while en route to Nashville. The regimental books, the papers, company property, camp equipage, officers' baggage, everything went up in smoke. So the entire first year of a little bit more of the regiment's history, all the records of it, completely gone. Of course, I'm sure they recreated them for the regimental history. I was not able to find a record of Karstetter's capture, but as Ken Karstetter noted that he was captured with the trains, I can only imagine the veracity of the statement that Rudolph Karstetter was with the trains, which came under attack by the Confederates, and he was captured. Because I didn't find any direct record of him, suggests to me that it's very possible that he was informally paroled on the same day, or somehow was captured and then managed to escape his captors in the chaos and confusion of what was going on the battlefield during that third day on January 1st. So there's a story of Rudolph Karstetter, and a big thank you to Ken for the call, the conversation, and introducing me to his grandfather. So thank you. Take care. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.